I was thinking about this kind of right around the time that I was rewatching for the third time now, season 2 of Good Omens. I've now watched it 3 times. With my mother, we kind of just keep bouncing back and forth between season 1 and season 2. And then, of course, I'm rereading the book. But in the meantime, my mother also decided to watch Red, White, and Royal Blue. And for some reason, I thought it was a TV show when it first was like announced or whatever. And so I was like, oh, okay, that'll be fun. And then it's not a TV show, it's just a movie. And I'm like, I don't know. I have weird issues with movies where it's like, I will sit down to watch 12 hours of television in a row, but for some reason like the thought of sitting down for a 2-hour film, I don't know why, I don't know what it is, but something about like actually sitting down to watch a 2-hour movie, even though I know that the television that I can watch or like YouTube videos I watch are a lot longer, that like actually the process of sitting down to watch a movie just always is weird for me. I don't like it that often. So I just happened to be working and she was watching it. So I saw a little bit of it while I was on my lunch break and I thought it was really cute. But it got me thinking, right? And what it got me thinking about specifically was how I really find that in general, a lot of members of the lesbian community, let's say, we go out of our way to put so much support and love into stories and TV shows and films about queer men. You know what I mean? Like, so much of the audience base for a lot of like fandom around stories that involve queer men, so many of those fandom spaces are usually more queer women than anything else. And I feel as though it seems to me that that's not a reciprocated thing, right? I feel like queer women put a lot of effort into loving and showing support for queer media involving queer men, but that is not a reciprocal thing, I don't feel like. And that's not exclusively true. Obviously, I think Trixie and Katya and even Bob the Drag Queen have kind of made a lot of effort to kind of, I don't want to say reach across the aisle because we're like part of the same team here, but I think there has been efforts made by some, gay men to reach out to lesbians. But it got me thinking about how frustrating it is that so often stories involving gay men specifically tend to be like lauded, and I think they can become like more mainstream. Like there's even I was just seeing an article talking about how Red, White, and Royal Blue was like this great big thing to bring queer stories into the mainstream, but yet that doesn't happen for lesbians ever. The thing with stories about gay men is like straight women love them, lesbians love them, and gay men usually love them. Kind of, it's, can be complicated. But for stories about lesbians, the only ones who are really watching it are lesbians, and sometimes not even us, because one of the biggest issues that I've noticed is that we don't even know about every story that happens to have lesbians in it, because there's like this double standard where it almost immediately gets canceled. Like Orange is the New Black is one of the few shows I can think of in recent history that had representation of lesbians, representation of butches in particular, and that kind of representation that didn't immediately get canceled, like within a season, and was not a period-specific film or television show. Because one of the big things, too, that I'm noticing recently, like in the last 5 years, almost every single solitary story that does involve queer women in some way is a period piece. Like, they're doing The Rise of the Pink Ladies, which is like a pre-Grease thing, which has some lesbianism. They're doing a reboot. They did a reboot, which I think Rise of the Pink Ladies already was canceled. They did a reboot of A League of Their Own, which included more queer women, which is set in the 1940s and 50s, which I don't know if that was canceled, but I'm pretty sure was already. We had Carol, which came out, I think, in 2015, which was a period piece. Gentleman Jack, another period piece. Ratched, which had one great season. We've heard nothing since about the second season, or if there's even gonna be a second season. It's kind of been rumored back and forth. Also another period piece. Like, there's all of these films and television shows in particular from the last 6 years that have all been fine and great or whatever. I haven't watched I didn't watch any of A League of Their Own, and I didn't watch Rise of the Pink Ladies because, whatever, I don't care for Grease. Sorry, I'm just gonna say it. Like, I've never cared for it. I never found it interesting, so I have no interest in watching that either. I know that I should be better in supporting, lesbians in media, but like, I think it's already been canceled anyway, so it really doesn't matter. Like, there's so few stories that are modern stories that aren't just immediately canceled. And almost all of them, if they do exist at all featuring queer women, are like, some fucking 1950s thing, or maybe it's kids media, but it feels like it's just so weird to me. It's so weird. And it drives me up the wall that this continues to be a thing where our stories either don't get told or they get told incompletely. And it's like, yeah, great. Another, love story between two feminine white women. Like, that's great. I really needed that again. Like, no offense to Carol, but that's really what that was. And like, I still love it. I'm not going to say that I don't love Carol. I am not going to say that I don't watch it every, holiday religiously. Like, I do. New Year's and Christmas, that is my film for New Year's and Christmas. Like, I'm not going to pretend like I don't watch it and that I don't love Carol. But what I'm saying is, it is what it is. It's not exactly, breaking boundaries here. I really feel like it could have been, but again, that's another thing too, is I feel like even me saying that is me holding it to such a ridiculously high standard. And one of the things that I was thinking about is I feel like in general, as a creator of queer media, for such a long time, I have put such an incredible amount of pressure onto myself of like, my work has to be this like universal thing. It has to be something that everyone can love, like straight people, gay people, lesbians, whatever. Like, everyone should be able to love this and enjoy this and interact with this. And I've had this in my head, and it took me until very, very recently to realize that this feeling that I had was actually stopping me from getting anything written, because it is such an incredible pressure to put on yourself to say, like, I want my story to come off as, universally beloved, when that's not something you have any control over, actually. The people who are going to enjoy your work are going to enjoy your work regardless of a lot of different factors, and you don't really have control over that. You just have to write how you feel and what you enjoy and go from there. But there's not really any way to control who is and isn't going to respond to it. And I think it's because there's this unfortunate stigma, right, with so much of queer media, where it's like, especially if it's a book, but even with television and movies, it's this stigma of like, oh, that's, it's just for gay people. And so it's, nobody else can watch it, nobody else can enjoy it, is how it comes off. Or it's somehow less than because it's queer specific media. You know what I mean? It's like it's relegated into its own little category, not to be seen by anyone else. And that's how it feels. And as a writer, I don't want to be limited like that. I don't want to be told that my work is only fit for like one specific section. And yeah, you can say, well, it's a genre, but it's not, because there's like subgenres, there's categories. If something includes LGBT characters, that is not the genre itself. It's still a fantasy novel. It's still a romance novel. It's still, everything else. It's more than the, some of its parts, as it were. So this idea that like, well, actually, if you're writing a queer novel that or a novel that is queer and that, it follows LGBT characters and themes, that becomes the actual, like, that ends up becoming what the genre is decided that it is. And that's really frustrating, because on the one hand, it's like, yes, I, as a reader, want to know that this story includes these themes because that's what I'm looking for. On the other hand, it's frustrating that it feels like you're kind of saying, like, there's fantasy, there's, sci-fi, there's romance, and then there's gay, which is just an amalgamation of everything. Figure it out for yourself. That is how it comes off at times. And it reads like, oh, it's this lesser thing that isn't as important in literary terms. It's not good literary speaking, literarily. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but you know what I mean. It's like, it's just a stigmatization, basically, of what the story is, what it's going to be about. You can almost guarantee it's going to be some tragic coming out story, maybe somewhere in there that's going to be part of it. There is so much assumption. And even me saying this, like, look, I am clearly making assumptions, and I realize that. But I'm kind of doing so to make a point. And the point is, like, even amongst queer people, there is this assumption of what stories that have, like, LGBTQIA themes means, and what it means, what people are expecting when they see that, versus what they should be expecting, and what, frankly, it should just be, yeah, this is a sci-fi novel that happens to have characters that are gay or lesbian or whatever. This is a romance novel that just happens to have this in it. It should not be like, this is the primary defining factor of this story, and nothing else about it really matters. Because that's just kind of messed up to me. And so, I think for a long time, there was maybe some, like, internalized shit about how I felt about the idea of being relegated to, the LGBT section of the bookstore. I think there is some kind of internalized, not self-loathing, but certainly an internalized idea that, well, clearly, if I'm here, it means my work is not as important, not as valuable, not as interesting, because that's how people seem to treat it. And so I'm kind of doing that same thing. And, I'm trying to say, well, I need to get out of that idea and that genre so that I can write something that people take seriously, is basically how I felt. Like, I just, I've always wanted my work to be taken seriously. But then I really sat down and thought about it. And one of the things I realized was, besides being too hard on myself, like, we're not actually being honest about queer literature or straight media in general. Take something like, the Fast and the Furious franchise, right? There are about, 80 of those films at this point, and there is no expectation that they should ever have to be anything other than what they are. There is nobody sitting around saying, boy, I wish those Fast and Furious movies were, like, more serious and more, like, Oscar worthy. There's no point where anyone thinks that, but those movies are still allowed to exist. They still continue to make them. They still continue to make money hand over fist. There's no question about whether or not there needs to be a Fast and the Furious 30. There's no question of it, because it's just going to happen. But with something regarding gay and lesbian and trans and bi and, queer media, there is this idea that it somehow must, A, appeal to everyone. Otherwise, it's not going to be making any money. It's not going to be worth making. But also there's this idea that somehow it has to be more than what it is. There's this idea, and I think it's even something that's ingrained in a lot of queer people too, where we feel like our stories that we tell have to be something way more interesting than any straight story is ever expected to be. You think about something like Brokeback Mountain, which is, like, such a fucking tragic thing, but it was very, very popular, very, very well liked. And it was just like, okay, well, and it was considered Oscar bait, which is a whole other thing. But it's like, oh, it's this great story, and it could just be a simple cowboy love story, but no, it has to have, this horrible tragic ending in order for it to be anything worthwhile, because you have to remind people this love can exist, but it's not forever, and you will die for it, and you should just be grateful that we're talking about it. That's kind of how it comes off, to be honest with you. And I feel like I'm going on kind of a lot of different tangents with this, but it's always frustrating to me how much there's this idea that you should just be grateful that these stories exist at all, but that they have to be something more. They have to include all of these, like, tragic elements to them. And I get it, like, this is not exclusive to queer people. Like, let's be honest, this has been happening to so many groups of people. I mean, right now, for God's sakes, the entirety of the whole Oppenheimer thing is like talking about a story that doesn't include a lot of people who were harmed by the creation of the atomic bomb. And so, there's so many people in many different ways who were actively harmed by that whole experience, but their story is not being told. Their experience is not being told because it's just about, one guy and his whole thing. I haven't seen it, so I don't fucking know. I could be wrong, but as far as I've heard, it doesn't include any of the actual, people who were harmed by this. It's not including people, Japanese people whom the bomb was dropped on. It's not including the people of New Mexico who lost a lot of shit and homes and lives and, their health was fucked up from the testing. It doesn't include any of that. And it's like, it's so strange to me how, we can continue to make these movies where it's like you want to talk about things that are important, but only insofar as it makes you feel good. And so, you have this whole thing where if these stories get made at all, it is so clearly made with the intention of making certain people feel comfortable while also acting as though it's trying to placate other people who want their stories told. And so you're in this, tug of war here. And it's just really frustrating. Bottom line, I think my frustration is just like, you either have these stories not being told, or when they are told, it's weirdly like separated, because in order for our stories to be taken seriously, they have to include something tragic. They have to include something devastating. They can't just be a silly little love story. That isn't allowed. It has to be tragic. There has to be something more. It has to be, the end of the world. And that was one of the other things too, is like, on the one hand, I saw reviews that were like, yeah, this is changing the idea of the mainstream queer story. And then I was also seeing reviews that were like, this is terrible, this isn't a good film. And I'm like, I kind of wonder if the reason that there are people saying it's not a good film is because they feel like it should be more than what it is. Like if it's just a little, kind of romantic young adult novel, why is that not good enough? Like, why can it not just be a little young adult love story? They made like 52 fucking tragedy porn kid cancer movies in like the span of 3 years, but God forbid gay people have a slight love story that isn't tragic. Like, what are we doing here? You know what I mean? Like, I get it. I'm on like 12 different tangents here. I'm not even sure what the fuck I'm talking about half the time. I'm just frustrated because I just feel like I said, there is this expectation that if you're going to have a story that involves any LGBTQIA people at all, it either has to be something tragic is happening to them in order to make the story worth anyone's time or make it worthy or important enough or whatever, or it just shouldn't exist, is what it comes down to. It comes down to this idea that it either has to appeal to straight people and be tragic and be something for you to gawk at, or it just is bad and shouldn't exist. That's the two options that we have. Or it should be set in the 1950s and 40s where it's almost guaranteed that something tragic is going to happen because it was just that time period, everyone can agree that you couldn't be gay in that time period. And it's like, well, yeah, but people were, like, it did still happen. So like, I don't think it's entirely realistic to do it this way either. It's just, it's so fucking frustrating to me. And that is kind of why I appreciate a show like Good Omens, where it does, and I didn't expect to bring it back to this, but I guess we kind of have to. That is kind of why I like that show in particular, is because it's like, it's modern, it does include lesbians, it does include, people under the trans umbrella, and it doesn't feel like, yeah, okay, there's tragic parts to it, but it's not tragic for the sake of being tragic. You know what I mean? It's not like kill your gays shit. It's not like, or bury your gays, I guess. What the fuck's the difference? Kill, bury, it's all the fucking same. It's not tragic for no reason. It's not, by the way, that is not to say that, hard coming out stories don't exist and have no place in film. let us not pretend like these stories are not still happening, and that this is, there are plenty of people for whom coming out is a very traumatic experience and they lose everything. And that's real. And those are important stories. But I just feel like, there's this idea that's the only story that's allowed to be told, because any other story is just going to be seen as kind of superfluous and not as important, and therefore not worth telling. And I just feel like that's a really miserable way to look at the world. It's a very miserable kind of thought process of like, well, if it's not something, fucking depressing happening, then it's not really worth telling that story.
Editing Cissa here. As I was editing this, I was also thinking about the fact that like all of this conversation doesn't even take into account all of the issues right now when it comes to queer media and the fact that it's constantly under attack. Especially right now, we're seeing queer media books that are being burned and banned, and this whole idea that queer media is inherently dangerous and overly sexual and all these other things. And that's like an entirely different conversation that I think absolutely does need to be had. And that's an entirely different conversation that kind of takes this all in a totally different direction. I guess when I was like making this video, I wasn't thinking about that, because I try not to think about it as much as possible, if I'm being honest. But that is something that like you can't not discuss, because it is something that comes up. It's something that is a huge deal. We are living in a time where on the one hand, queer media is expected to be more than it is, and on the other hand, it's also under attack for what it is. And so we're really pulled in all different directions with this, and it's kind of wild and scary as hell.
Like, I don't know. I just want a story where, the characters can just be happy and in love, and it's not a big deal. And even if it's silly and trite, and even if it's whatever, at least it doesn't have to be something tragic all the fucking time. Like, I feel like we can just do stories where it's just not always tragic. You know what I mean? Like, that should be allowed. We should be allowed to have stories that aren't fucking tragic all the time. And I don't know why that feels like that's such a huge ask, but it seems to be. And so I'm just over here like, can we just get stories where it's just cute and sweet and it doesn't have to be anything more than what it is? Ultimately, look, the bottom line is there's no getting around that capitalism is like the death of art. There's no getting around that. I think it's great in theory, right, to be an artist getting paid for your work. That's amazing. That's something that's really cool. And that's something that, because we live in the society we do, is necessary. Like, in order to survive, you have to get paid for your work. But what it means is that, unfortunately, because art is not very well appreciated, because art is so often seen as less than and taken for granted and, undermined at every fucking turn, despite the fact that people very clearly crave and desire good art and like good art, it's not well appreciated very often. And so you end up in this situation, and, artists are not well appreciated, and we're so often, screwed over. And so you end up in this situation where ultimately art becomes a hobby. It doesn't become something that's actually feasible to do anything with. And in that way, so much otherwise, amazing art that people would get to see and enjoy kind of just gets lost to time, because, the artists can't afford to do anything with it. And thankfully, the internet being what it is, I think we have more opportunities for art to be shared than ever before. And I'm so, so grateful for that. But I don't know. It's just interesting. Yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like this video, comment down below, tell me if any of this made sense and what you think of it. And of course, subscribe to this channel. You can also subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/NarcissaDeVille, where I do behind the scenes and extended edits for those of you who like my longer videos. Aww. And until next time, stay devilish.